Welcome to another episode of The Golden Hour. I'm Sharif Yunus here with Dr. Kevin Majers. Kevin, thanks for joining us again.
Sharif, great to be back.
Well, I found an interesting quote on the Headspace blog that relates to the daily schedule, the topic for today's episode. So let me read it for you, Kevin, and then we can discuss it. It's from Haruki Murakami, who's an author, and he writes, "When I'm in writing mode for a novel, I get up at 4 a.m. and work for 5 to 6 hours. In the afternoon, I run for 10 kilometers or swim for 1,500 meters, or do both. Then I read a bit and listen to some music. I go to bed at 9 p.m. I keep to this routine every day without variation. The repetition itself becomes the important thing. It's a form of hypnosis. I hypnotize myself to reach a deeper state of mind." Well, Kevin, since this covers the topic of the schedule and also hypnosis, two things that you're an expert on, I thought you might be able to comment on the strategies that Haruki is using, and maybe we can draw some lessons here for our viewers and listeners.
It's interesting his use of the word hypnosis, or I think in the original he said mesmerism, but which is a very old term for hypnosis. I think there is hypnosis, it seems, when you look at it in an fMRI machine, is the same as when you're in a state of flow. So it might be that what he's really talking about is how does he set the stage to work in flow? And he was saying that he does that by having this unvarying routine, so that his day starts at exactly the same time and he does the same kinds of things in the different blocks of the day. And so it makes sense to me that it would help him to be extremely productive because his mind knows what to expect at what time. That this is a big issue, right? That, like, how does your brain know what to get ready for the next activity, the next task? And that's much of what our brains are doing is just predicting what we're going to do next. The easier you make it by having these routines in place, the easier it is for it to not be spending time debating energy, like wasted, just thinking, what do I do now, and reinventing, every day anew. But instead, you have your certain fixed things, and then you can do the more creative, interesting work with less interference.
And it's interesting that he has it seems like he has a lot of freedom to craft his schedule as he wants. He's a writer, so he gets into writing mode and he can spend maybe days, weeks, or even months, I don't know, in this mode where he has complete control over his schedule. Other people might feel like, well, I don't have as much control as he does. I work with other people, or my boss requires things of me, or family considerations. So how do you apply this to people who might feel like they actually have less control over everything they do, so that they can't craft this type of schedule or this rhythm or routine?
Yeah, that's a great question. It seems that some people have the luxury of being able to do that kind of, I guess it means that his writing is just taking over his life, because it sounds like that's the thing he's optimizing for. Maybe it's not going to be the case for everyone that you're optimizing for work, but that even then in family life, do you have regular schedules? I think that on the one hand, anyone will benefit from having non-negotiables scheduled in his or her day. So, and that's always true. Even if it feels like there's a lot of chaos in life, the chaos is normal. You're gonna, and it's, sometimes chaos will be more pronounced, but to the extent you can do it, it pays off to see what can you really fix as patterns in your schedule that you in fact do have control over. Just mentioning family, so it reminds me that there have been studies that show that when families have routines of how they do things, and I guess it would mean like the family timetable, that you have how the morning runs, and then if people are home, how, when you have lunch, and then having a dinner time and dinner conversation. All of those sense of family routines ends up benefiting the kids in measurable ways. And the two that I remember being mentioned once were that the children actually have better social skills, which is interesting. I'm not exactly sure why that's the case, but somehow they're made more social. Maybe it's just because meals are being regularly done together. And then the other is they have better academic performance. So they get better grades when the family has these regular routines, and they have less stress, I also think, during crises if the family maintains the schedule, in tumultuous times. So for families, it's also super important to get into a healthy rhythm, of how the day starts, how the workday ends, how the dinner happens, what you do in the evenings together, so that there's good family time for protected family time in the evenings. So all of that gets into this idea of having non-negotiables in your day. Because again, so much energy is wasted when you're having to decide constantly what to do. The more it's decided in advance, the better.
What should these non-negotiables be for us? One thing we talk about a lot is waking up on time. We talk about exercise, meditation, prayer, forms of silence, maybe time for reading or study. Do you have a kind of complete list in your mind of what these non-negotiables should be?
I think that you hit a lot of the big ones. I would also say meal times and breaks. And so if you could imagine then crafting your schedule, and in fact on OptimalWork.com, Sharif, you have a guided session on this of how to plan the day. And there I believe the first step is what are the fixed things that you want in your schedule? And I think that's, when you're thinking about that, what do you want in every day? You're thinking in a sense about the long term. So you're thinking about how do you be crafting your life? And that is a different kind of thinking process than when you're in the midst of the day deciding what to do next, where you're going to tend to do short-term thinking. So there's a real value in having long-term thinking to sit down and say, okay, what do I want to commit to? Wake up time, and then exercise, and time for meditation or some kind of prayer or silence, as you said, meals, meetings. If you have fixed meetings, then those should be in your calendar, and so that you just know to expect these meetings. And once you put all those things in, and all the right time for them, and breaks too, what emerges then is, I think what Cal Newport calls a negative schedule. And so the negative schedule is all of that stuff you can then kind of cut out of the schedule. And you just look at what is left over, and those are the blocks of time where now you can get your best work done. And that's where you try to do golden hours.
And this is very deeply connected to the inventory question. My daily priorities reflect what matters most for me to have a fulfilling life, is making time for these non-negotiables so that we're thinking for the long term.
And you mentioned reading, for instance, just to say, say you're going to commit to a certain kind of reading. So it could be I want to do more professional reading each day, or philosophical reading, whatever it might be. Okay, I'm going to commit, say, 10 minutes to this. Well, if it's not really fixed, you would each day end up debating, do I have time to do it? Do I have energy to do it? Something special happens when you just make it non-negotiable. And this is just every day after breakfast or, to wrap up my workday, whatever it might be, I just schedule this in and do it. And once it's non-negotiable, it's it doesn't weigh anything. As long as you're debating doing one of these types of things, you count the cost all the time, and it just feels heavy. But once it's a commitment, it becomes light. And then these are the ways you incorporate good habits that end up giving you longer, sustainable energy.
Now, Kevin, when we're starting to build these new habits and incorporating these non-negotiables into the schedule, it can often feel like we're fighting an uphill battle, that it's tough to add these things to our schedule. Do you have any tips on how to make that happen? And then also just think about how long does it kind of take before it becomes almost automatic and just natural for us to do these things each day?
Those are great questions. There is research that speaks to how long does it take. When you try to get a new daily habit worked into your routine, according to studies, the average amount of time it takes for it to become effortless or automatic, just built in, is 66 days. So basically, you have 2 months on average of doing something. But the nice thing is, according to the study, it doesn't have to be that was every day. There could be days where you couldn't do it, and that doesn't seem to change how long it takes. But there's a lot of variation among different people, and how, because some people were able to build and fix in these new habits in 18 days. And for others, the outlier was 254 days. So it's a wide variety. So basically, from 2 weeks is the shortest to 2 months is the typical, but then what is it, like 2/3 of a year? But it's interesting, isn't it, that like why would it take that many days for it to be? And my guess would be that if you haven't really had the habit of a regular wake-up time or regular practices for keeping up your, whatever it might be, meditation practice or exercise, that first having fixed things like this can take a while, but then your skill at incorporating new fixed habits gets stronger. So you're able to more progressively incorporate these fixed habits. But it's not like also that there's an infinite number of them. Really, it's a small number. And there's a debate about, is it better for people to try to do more all at one time? Or should you just incorporate one, and then once it's solid, then incorporate the next? I don't think there's a general answer for that. People should probably just get a sense of what they feel up for, and can they, how do they, but most of them, when you talk about meals, or you talk about meetings, those are just going to happen anyway. So really we're talking about some of these other ones that are more like taking care of yourself. Okay, well then those you want to make sure you incorporate in a stable way, spacing out if need be.
I have one theory, which is
What's that?
well, it's when you talk about anxiety and you talk about shaping your amygdala in these kind of high pressure situations, doing these exposures. But if you don't reframe the exposure, then it doesn't actually reshape your amygdala, or at least not nearly as much. I think sometimes
Takes much longer.
Yeah, if you're doing these new habits kind of grudgingly or reluctantly, I have to do this, then I could see that it would take a lot more time. Whereas if you can engage enthusiastically, my guess would be it would become a habit much quicker.
I think that's exactly right. Yeah, and my sense is that part of what makes it also easier to reframe is you understand something of cause and effect, and it just makes sense to you that this works. So if you understand what the benefits of meditating daily really are for the day, and then you see, oh yeah, that's true, maybe it takes a couple weeks for you to consistently see, yeah, this is actually better. But then it's easy to be on board with doing it. But then you're right, that if you're in general seeing this as a great opportunity for growth, bring it on, then that makes sense. It would happen much faster.
Maybe now we could get into some of the relationship between the default mode network and scheduling, getting into a little bit more also of the kind of benefits in addition to having your daily priorities reflect what matters most to have a meaningful life. But now also there are a lot of benefits to training your default mode, to enabling you to rest better, get things off your plate. So I wonder if you could speak to that.
Yeah, I think that there is a neuroscience supporting scheduling and why it's so important to do it in advance. And it's just like when you are setting down to start doing an hour of work, we know from huge experience that laying out the steps in advance, now it might be writing it down, and that's why we have people do a golden hour online, but at least in your head, you have a sense of what are the steps and how long am I going to give to them. Well, it just makes it unfold naturally then as you go through that hour, and then you finish it on time. So to get that work done by the stop time, it just helps to have done some planning in advance so that your predictive attention, the default attention, knows what to prepare and how to pull you through the task. So it just works in the background, pulling your task attention through. But the whole thing works the same for a day. So if you want to have a day that it gives you the best in terms of work and life and relationships and rest, you want to craft it in advance. One, so that as you're crafting it, you're thinking about what's long-term sustainable. But then also because you're laying out for your default attention the path that it's going to be pulling you through as the day goes on. So when I make a schedule for my practice, in my schedule, I have the names of the people I'm going to be seeing. And that just helps that, so when I finish one day of my clinic, I'm looking at the next day. Somehow seeing who I'm going to talk to the next day is now put into my default mode. And when I see those people the next day, I am very ready to talk to them. But if I just had, patient one, patient two, patient three, and then I discovered in the moment who it's going to be, I'd always be taken by surprise. So there is a real benefit to setting up things in advance because you're just more ready for it when the time comes.
Oftentimes I notice that towards the end of the workday, or after the workday is over, I know that I have things on my plate to do tomorrow, and I start to cogitate about those and try to solve those problems in advance when I really should be doing something else, like spending time, actually committing to the people I'm with. Is there any way that changing the way I schedule can kind of shape that?
Yeah, there are studies done on people who worry that show that if they can just put in their schedule a time to address that concern, they get it off their mind. And they just report that they're worrying much less about those things. And so that's true in the case of like when you have a real intense concern. But I think, like you discover, it's always true that if you end your day and then rather than letting things stay percolating in your mind, you get them off your mind by scheduling things for the next day. You have much more peace at night. That our brains need to know when to turn off the day's work, and it's easier for it if there is a schedule in the future when it's going to come back to it. Otherwise, it's like, oh, but there's this idea, and there's this idea, and there's this thing he has to remember, and there's this, and it keeps reminding you at the wrong times. So we kind of train ourselves by bringing the day to a close. So like after I'm done seeing patients, the last thing I do then is close out that day and get ready for the next briefly. So it's a tiny little ritual, but I think it helps me to not stay thinking about things and cogitating about things, for the rest of the night. Having these closure routines and scheduling the next day, I think, is one of the best ways of closing out the current day and then getting it off of your mind. And if there is something that you need to think about, then even it might be like dedicate, okay, I need to spend 15 minutes planning this conference. Then you just make sure that that's put in to your schedule the next day so that it's not on your mind all night.
One other thing that I found helpful in that regard is the 2-minute rule. So it's if you know that you have to do something and it's going to take 2 minutes or less, just do it right now. What do you think about that, and how does that fit into the idea of scheduling?
Well, if that's happening, like when you're wrapping up your day, then taking care of odds and ends would be the time to use, I think, that kind of 2-minute rule. But if it's in the middle of an hour of work on something else, it's probably better just to have a place where you write things down that you'll get to when you have time to process those little 2-minute items, like a parking lot. So you set things aside there. But in general, yeah, you want to be getting things off your mind. So you just handle things right away, you deal with them right away. I think that there's a lot of unnecessary kind of suffering that people have from simply delaying responding to this email or this text message, and they think about it too much. It's better just to have at least a scheduled time for dealing with those things and then just get them kind of addressed, be kind of bold in just answering things right away so that it's not there waiting for you. So that's the same idea of, yeah, if you can get it done, then great, get it done.
Great. Well, Kevin, you're not going to believe it, but we are basically out of time for today. So I don't know if you have any final thoughts you want to leave us with.
Well, it has to do with the sense of, we often quote the saying, that peace is the tranquility of order. And I love that phrase, the tranquility of order. But when life is crazy and you want more peace, then you need to have more order. And the best way of getting that in the context of a day is the schedule. The neat thing about that kind, like what order does, what order gives us, is yes, it does give us peace, but it also gives us energy. and it gives us quickness in our thoughts. That when you lay things down, schedule them, you know what to expect, you get peace, and you get energy and drive.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Kevin. We
Thank
will
you, Sharif.
be back next week.